Greetings from the AZ Fly Shop, Phoenix, Arizona. My name is Steve Hilbert. I'm from South Carolina, out visiting my son family here for a vacation. And I happened to stop in at the Thursday night get together for informal fly tying at the AZ shop. And they asked me to demonstrate one of the flies that I tied. And so what I'd like to do is show you one of the most effective striper flies that I use back in South Carolina on our reservoirs and in the river. And so we're going to tie a crafty fly that's made of craft fur as a Clouser style and show you exactly how we tie it and what the materials are and talk about how useful it is in our waters. First of all, we're going to start with a fire hole number 4 hook. It's a streamer hook that I find very effective. It's tough and it'll do the job for us real well. And then I'm going to put some 5/32 Spirit River Dazzle Eyes on top as the Clouser style. And we're going to get started with some Hairline Extra Select Craft Fur in white. And we're also going to use the Dun Gray Craft Fur. For a little bit of flash for a gill strip, we're going to use some Crystal Flash in the red. And for our sideline flash in the rear, we're going to use the Flashaboo in Holo Silver. So let's tie this fly. I tie for my company, H&H Streamer Guys, along with one of my young men that I have taught how to tie flies, and quite frankly, he, in a very short period of time, outpaced the master by a long stretch. So Hugh is the other half of Hilbert H&H and Hilbert and Hugh Streamer Guys. And his flies are second to none. As a young man, he has taken this craft and turned it into an art form. Now I'm going to tie this little strip of craft fur up the fly toward the eye, and I cut it off where I am going to attach the Clouser eyes. That gives me a stop automatically, and so I can get a pretty consistent shape, size, orientation of all the materials on the hook by doing so. And of course, as we put on our lead eyes, we're going to do the figure 8. And I am also known as half hitch because almost everything I do, if I have to stop somewhere along the line, requires a half hitch to secure things. And then I always like to put a drop of glue, Zap-A-Gap, on the lead eyes to make sure they don't ever have to twist or move around. We're going to take the Flashaboo, and I normally cut a little strip out of the plastic, and that way I don't have to pull the material out of the packet every time. And you can simply stick your scissors in, grab some strands, and I normally on this fly will take 6 to 8 and use them. What I like to do is put them the length of the tail on the far side, pinch thread, tie up a few wraps simply because that allows me to bring it to the back side, and that way when I tie, it lays along the side perfectly and I don't ever have to wonder about it spinning or turning. I'll take the remainder and I will use it as flash up the body of the fly, up to the back of the lead eyes. And it just gives a little interior flash to the minnow pattern. This minnow pattern that I'm tying actually represents the shad that are the forage food in the rivers and the reservoirs where I fish in South Carolina. Trim off the excess, put my little half hitch on there, and we're good to go to the next step. Now I always like to put a gill strip look in my minnow patterns. And this comes via Henry Cowan, who is a guide, very famous guide in Georgia, and he fishes mainly on Lake Lanier, which is just north of Atlanta. And Lake Lanier is slam full of striped bass and spotted bass. And he has done numerous experiments where he claims flies with the gill strip highlight versus flies without it will outfish 2 to 1. And so it's not a big deal to put this strip on, and all we do is tie a little bit of the flash to each side, trim it off, and we're done with the flash. And what happens is that will show through the next segment of craft fur that I'm going to put starting behind the eye of the hook. Gunnar Brammer is a young fly tyer extraordinaire out of Minnesota, and he demonstrates what he calls rip stacking, to be able to stack material that you can't put in a stacking tool, and it's just a matter of pulling it apart and getting it aligned by itself. So that's about where I'm at. And I have a technique of cutting off the material so that I don't have to trim it afterward. And if you just extend it a little bit and get a thread wrap or two, you can pull it to where you want it, lock it down, and there will be no trimming afterward. Run a couple of wraps of thread behind, and it lays the top piece of craft fur right where you want it. One more time with a half hitch, secure the white craft fur on technically the bottom of the fly, roll it over, and now I'm going to put the gray back. Almost every bait fish, the top, the back, is darker than the belly, obviously. So in this case, for the shad, I'm using just a bit of gray, and we're going to do the same technique where we cut it off first, wrap softly over it, catch it, make sure it rolls exactly where we want it, and there is no trimming when you're done. Taper a little head between the eye of the hook and the lead eyes. Make sure everything's out of the way. Whip finish, usually 3 or 4, and because I'm going to use some Zap-A-Gap on it, I don't need to use an excessive number of wraps on the whip finish. Now a little Zap-A-Gap on here, and there's one more thing I want to make sure everybody understands. I always run some glue across the top of the craft fur where I've gone over the lead eyes, because this is the part of material, if any of it, that's going to come in contact with the rocks in the bottom. And so we're looking at making sure that this gets glued up here so that it secures all the material, because this fly is going to bounce on the rocks. And the whole point of that in the river system in Carolina is that's where the bait fish are running. So striper catching is totally dependent on finding the bait, imitating the bait, matching the hatch if you will, and presenting a fly in a lively enough manner that they accept it as their food forage. And so here we have the crafty Clouser for the Carolina stripers. This is a very simple craft fur pattern that anybody who has just even a little bit of ability to tie flies will find enjoyable to tie. It's so effective for the stripers and the spotted bass and the largemouth bass that we fish in the rivers and the reservoirs in Carolina. I'm totally confident also that you will find it effective in the reservoirs that you have locally. I have fished this in Bull Shoals River, caught trout. I have fished this in the Tennessee tail races and caught trout and stripers. So I'm very confident. It is one of the first flies that I grab out of my box when I'm going to go chase some stripers and some bass.